picture this, it's the early 1960s, and four lads from Liverpool are struggling to break out of the local music scene. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, the Beatles, are playing in dingy clubs, honing their sound while dreaming of stardom. Enter Brian Epstein, a smartly dressed manager who spotted the raw potential in the scruffy band. He promised them more than just gigs at the Cavern Club, he promised them the world. And for a while it seemed like Epstein was their ticket to everything they'd ever wanted. But behind the glimmering facade of Beatlemania, tensions and mistrust were simmering. Epstein's choices, both personal and professional, would eventually lead to a feeling of betrayal that still echoes through music history today. It was November 1961 when Brian Epstein first walked into the Cavern Club in Liverpool. Think of the scene. The club was filled with damp air, cigarette smoke, and the electric energy of the crowd. The Beatles, clad in leather jackets, were rough around the edges, but Epstein saw something special in them, a charisma that could be molded into mainstream success. Unlike other local managers, Epstein came from a wealthy background, owning a family-run record store called Nem's North End Music Stores. He was polished, ambitious, and eager to find his place in the music business. Epstein convinced the Beatles that he could elevate their image and broaden their appeal. He asked them to clean up their look, swapping leather for tailored suits and adopting the iconic mop-top haircuts. And the band, seeing the promise of bigger stages, took a chance on him. It wasn't long before he secured their first recording contract with Parlophone, thanks to producer George Martin. By 1962, the Beatles released Love Me Do and the world began to notice. Epstein delivered on his promises, perhaps more than the Beatles could have imagined. By 1963, they were topping charts in the UK, and by 1964, Beatlemania had taken America by storm. It was an era where teenage girls fainted at the sight of the band, and every Beatles record seemed to turn to gold. Epstein managed their hectic schedules, arranged their press interviews, and booked them into historic venues like Carnegie Hall. He seemed like the fifth Beatle, the man behind the curtain pulling the strings that made the Beatles a global phenomenon. But as the band's fame grew, cracks began to show. Epstein's business acumen, which had once been an asset, was now in question. His enthusiasm for managing the Beatles was unmatched, but his understanding of the music industry's legal intricacies lagged behind. As offers poured in from all directions, Epstein negotiated contracts that would soon reveal themselves to be less than favorable. Merchandise deals were made hastily, giving away significant profits to third parties. In one infamous deal, Epstein signed away the rights to Beatles merchandise in the United States for a mere 10% royalty, a decision that would cost the band millions as their fame skyrocketed. Think of this moment: the Beatles, now world famous, realized that they were losing millions of dollars. Epstein, who had taken on the role of a guardian for the band, had made a series of financial mistakes that were almost impossible to reverse. As Beatlemania continued, so did the flood of merchandise: lunchboxes, dolls, wigs, posters, and anything that could bear their name. But the profits from these items were going into the pockets of others, while the Beatles saw a fraction of the earnings. Even the recording contracts, which Epstein negotiated early in their career, were not as advantageous as they could have been. The Beatles' initial agreement with EMI offered them a small royalty percentage compared to the massive sales they were generating. These agreements might have been understandable when the band was still unknown, but as their popularity soared, it became clear that they had signed away too much. Behind the scenes, resentment began to build as the band members started to realize that Epstein's decisions were costing them dearly. Yet, it wasn't just business decisions that led to a sense of betrayal. Brian Epstein's personal struggles played a significant role in the breakdown of his relationship with the Beatles. He was a closeted gay man during a time when homosexuality was illegal in Britain, a reality that filled his life with secrecy and fear. Epstein's anxiety and loneliness often led him to risky behaviors, like pursuing relationships in dangerous places and struggling with drug addiction, particularly to pills like barbiturates and stimulants. His fragile emotional state made it difficult for him to maintain the composure expected of a manager guiding the biggest band in the world. The Beatles, aware of his struggles, showed a certain level of sympathy, but it also complicated their dynamic. John Lennon, known for his sharp tongue, sometimes made cruel remarks about Epstein's sexuality, adding to the strain. There were whispers that Epstein's emotions sometimes clouded his judgment. His deep attachment to the band and desire for their approval might have led him to overlook better deals or act impulsively in their favor. As the band grew more independent, they began to see him less as a mentor and more as a man out of his depth, struggling to manage both his personal demons and the complexities of their ever-growing fame. By 1966, the Beatles were exhausted from touring and the chaos that followed them everywhere they went. Their decision to quit touring that year was a turning point, not just for the band but for Epstein as well. Touring had been Epstein's strength, organizing concerts, handling the logistics, and keeping the band in the public eye. But with live performances off the table, the band retreated to the studio, exploring new musical horizons. Albums like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band showcased their growth as artists, but they also signaled a shift away from the structure Epstein had built around them. Epstein struggled to find his place in this new phase. His control over the Beatles' day-to-day life waned as they took charge of their creative direction, collaborating more closely with producer George Martin and distancing themselves from Epstein's business oversight. Epstein's substance abuse worsened and his confidence dwindled. He tried to find new acts to manage, but none of them ever reached the heights of the Beatles. The group sensed his unease, and while they still respected him, they began to make decisions without him, an independence that Epstein couldn't quite accept. You've probably heard of the day in August 1967 when Brian Epstein was found dead in his London home. The official cause was an overdose of barbiturates, though the exact nature of his death, whether accidental or intentional, has always been a subject of speculation. For the Beatles, the news was devastating. Despite the growing distance between them, Epstein's death left them unmoored, suddenly facing a world without the man who had believed in them when no one else did. John Lennon later admitted, "I knew we were in trouble then. I didn't have any misconceptions about our ability to do anything other than play music." Epstein's death marked the beginning of a turbulent period for the Beatles. Without his guidance, they ventured into their ill-fated business venture, Apple Corps, and became entangled in legal and financial disputes that further strained their relationships. His absence was a void they could never quite fill. In the years after Brian Epstein's untimely death, the Beatles found themselves grappling with his legacy, a mix of gratitude and regret that colored their memories of the man who had once been their guiding star. Picture this: a band on top of the world, reflecting on the man who helped them reach those dizzying heights, yet also recalling the pitfalls that accompanied their rise. Paul McCartney, the ever-diplomatic Beatle, often spoke about Epstein's influence with a sense of reverence. He credited Epstein with shaping their early success, acknowledging that without him, the Beatles might never have become a global sensation. McCartney understood that Epstein's polish and professional demeanor had opened doors for them, doors that the scrappy young band from Liverpool couldn't have unlocked on their own. But beneath the gratitude, there was an underlying sense of disappointment, a lingering belief that Epstein's inexperience cost them dearly in financial terms. Paul's reflections often took on a tone of wistful what-ifs. He knew that Epstein's decision to trade away merchandising rights had cost them millions, but he also recognized the human element, the idea that Epstein, like them, was learning as he went. Yet even as he praised Epstein's contributions, there was a sense of something unspoken, a recognition of the times when Epstein's personal struggles had clouded his judgment. Think of it: the band, flying higher than any act had before, realizing that they had been vulnerable to the limitations of the man who managed them. John Lennon, ever more direct and less sentimental, cut straight to the core of his mixed feelings. He was known for speaking his mind, and when he referred to Epstein's management as a double-edged sword, it was as much a critique as an acknowledgement of their shared history. Lennon knew that Epstein had brought them from the rough and tumble clubs of Liverpool to global superstardom. Yet he also felt keenly the sense of betrayal over Epstein's mishandling of contracts, decisions that, to Lennon, seemed like acts of negligence, even if they weren't deliberate. There was a sense that, in Epstein's earnest attempt to protect and propel them, he had at times left them exposed to deals that would line the pockets of others. It was a brutal realization for a man like Lennon, who prized both honesty and loyalty above all else. Lennon's reflections, often tinged with bitterness, hinted at deeper feelings of abandonment. For all his bravado, he understood that Epstein's guidance had given him a sense of direction, a father figure of sorts during the tumultuous years of the Beatles' early fame. With Epstein gone, that anchor was gone too, leaving a void that the band's newfound independence couldn't entirely fill. Think of those conversations between Lennon and McCartney, two figures so central to the Beatles' creative core, talking late into the night about their fallen manager, alternating between gratitude for the man who had believed in them and frustration over the ways he had failed them. The story of Brian Epstein and the Beatles is not just one of a manager and his band, it is a narrative filled with human complexities, missteps, and the conflicting emotions that come with a deep, imperfect bond. Epstein's dedication to the Beatles was undeniable. He believed in them with a fervor that went beyond business. He wasn't just managing an act, he was shepherding a cultural phenomenon. Yet his devotion sometimes blinded him to the finer details of the industry's inner workings. He was the architect of their early image, the man who insisted they trade their leather jackets for suits, and who believed that the Beatles could be more than just a popular Liverpool band, they could be international icons. But in his eagerness to push them forward, he sometimes overlooked the intricacies of the deals that would shape their financial future. The band's sense of betrayal, then, is layered and complex. It's not the simple story of a manager who took advantage of his artists. Rather, it's a tale of unintentional mismanagement of a man whose ambition for his band was greater than his knowledge of the industry's ruthless nature. Epstein's desire to see the Beatles succeed led him to make decisions that were well-meaning but ultimately flawed. And while the Beatles came to see these mistakes for what they were, it didn't erase the sense that they had lost out on opportunities that could have changed the trajectory of their fortunes. But even in the midst of disappointment, there is no denying the admiration the Beatles held for Epstein's belief in their potential. Paul McCartney would later say that Epstein's death marked the beginning of their end, a point from which they would never fully recover. It wasn't just about losing a manager, it was about losing the man who had first seen them as more than just another band from Liverpool. Epstein's belief in the Beatles gave them the courage to believe in themselves, and in many ways that belief was worth more than any contract. Think of this: the Beatles standing together in the studio years after Epstein's death, aware that their creative partnership was slipping through their fingers. They had outgrown the suits, the screaming crowds, and even their own youthful dreams. Yet the absence of Epstein, the man who had once been their anchor, still hung in the air like a shadow. It was a reminder that no matter how high they soared, they could never fully escape the choices and relationships that had shaped their rise. Ultimately, the story of Brian Epstein and the Beatles is a reminder that success in the music industry is never just about the songs. It's about the people behind those songs, their dreams, their flaws, and sometimes their betrayals. It's a story where admiration and resentment can coexist, where gratitude doesn't erase the sting of lost opportunities. In the end, the Beatles' relationship with Brian Epstein stands as one of rock history's most poignant reminders that even the deepest connections are often marked by contradictions and complexities.